Welcome back to the industrial will be and try to find out that how in the industry how we work with this biochemical process. And if you look at the ethanol fermentation process, it appears to be the oldest fermentation process. Uh, and in India we have more than 250 distilleries, and this produces ethanol from the mostly from cane molasses. Some industry also use starchy raw materials like broken rice for the production of ethanol. Now today I am going to share my experience and the details of the ethanol fermentation process. Now if you look at the ethanol fermentation process, that it is called the alcoholic fermentation process, and is a biological process which converts the sugar into glucose and fructose and sucrose into the cellular energy, producing ethanol and carbon dioxide. Let me explain that. Because the sucrose, because I told you the cane molasses is found to be the very suitable raw materials for the ethanol fermentation process, and cane molasses contains about 50% of sugar. This sugar, in presence of the enzyme invertage, it is converted to glucose and fructose, and this glucose, again when you pass through the Embden-Bayerhoff pathway, it produces pyruvic acid, and pyruvic acid, when undergo decarboxylation reaction, it produces the acetaldehyde, and acetaldehyde, when it is reduced, it produces ethanol. I shall explain the details of these biochemical pathways. Now the yeast is the largely used for this ethanol fermentation process, and yeast perform the conversion in the absence of oxygen. Ethanol fermentation is considered anaerobic process. So yeast can grow in two ways. Under aerobic condition, it produces the cell mass, what we call baker's yeast, which is largely used in the bread making industry. But under anaerobic condition, sugar will be converted to ethanol. Now the classification of, if you look the classification of ethanol, we have two different classes. One is called tax alcohol, another we have non-tax alcohol. Tax alcohol is usually considered as a pure alcohol, and non-tax alcohol is the alcohol that is used as a chemical feedstock in the industry. Now since tax alcohol is the pure alcohol, this can be used for human consumption and used in the beverage industry, pharmaceutical industry, and perfumes largely used. But in non-tax alcohol used as a chemical feedstock like acetic acid, polythene industry and rubber industry, etc. But it is unfit for human consumption due to the addition of certain purposefully that we add certain chemicals to make the alcohol totally unfit for human consumption, because the cost of non-tax alcohol is very less as compared to tax alcohol. So, though it is and India, since we are the tropical country, the government of India, they don't encourage to take alcohol for human consumption. That is why they impose a lot of tax on it. Now denatured alcohol, this is non-tax alcohol. Basically it is the denatured alcohol. This is, as I told you, that it is we add certain additives which makes it poisonous, bad in taste, so foul smell or nauseating, and to discourage the recreational consumption. In some cases it is also dyed, so that everybody can understand that. So they use the different formula for preparing the denatured alcohol depending on the industry we are going to use, because when they add different chemicals in the denatured alcohol, they take into account those chemicals should not affect that particular chemical production process. So on the basis of that, they choose different formulas. Now the terminology, different types of alcohol we have in the market, we have different names. We have like grain alcohol, molasses alcohol, industrial alcohol, and powered alcohol. Now, powered alcohol is very interesting nowadays. We have lot of power shortage problem. The government they're insisting that gasoline, as you know, that India has the acute shortage of the petroleum because whatever reserves we have for petroleum is hardly for 30 years. So we mostly import the crude petroleum from outside, and which is very costly. So government of India they always encourage that 10 to 20% of gasoline that can be whether we can replace by ethanol. So when we use the ethanol as a substitute or gasoline, we call it powered alcohol. Now, in case of grain alcohol means that this alcohol is produced from grains such as corn, wheat, and rice. Molasses alcohol means it is produced from molasses, maybe cane molasses, maybe beet molasses. Industrial alcohol is used for the industrial purpose. Now, raw materials that is used for this alcohol fermentation process has three different types. One is we call that saccharine materials, which mostly comprises of sugar type of materials, which is easy to ferment, and so you don't require any kind of pre-treatment. But when we use the material like starchy materials and cellulosic material, it required the pre-treatment. Like in case of starchy material, like first starch has to degrade into glucose, then glucose with the help of Embton-Mayer pathway that it produces the ethanol. Now, in case of cellulosic material, cellulose is break down to glucose with the help of the enzymes like cellulose enzymes. We have exoglucanase, endoglucanase, alpha, beta 1 for glucosidase. The different enzymes they participate in the reactions, and then they convert it into glucose. Now, we use the wood and waste pulp liquor. Wood mostly we have lignocellulosic material. We remove the lignin, then the cellulose we hydrolyze and produce glucose. This glucose ultimately can be converted into ethanol. Now, it can be explained in this way that starch can be chemically pretreated with H2SO4 when hydrolyzed in presence of acid. We could get the saccharified starch. For the acid hydrolysis of starch, and this is take place at a high temperature and pressure, and which resulting the formation of brown compounds due to polymerization of sugar. An enzymatic process, we use the starchy material. Mostly we use the amylolytic enzymes for the conversion of the starch to sugar. And amylolytic enzymes also different types. We have alpha amylase, we have beta amylase, we have glucoamylase. So different type of enzymes they participate in the reactor to reaction and give the glucose. Now, in case of cellulose, mostly it is hydrolyzed by acid, the concentration HCl, concentrated HCl, or dilute H2SO4 to give the sugar. But both the cases we get have the Brownian reactions. But major problem, and also I told you enzymatically also we can convert the cellulose into glucose. In that case, we have to use the cellulose enzymes. Now, question comes, what are the microorganisms that used in the alcohol fermentation process? The two type of microorganism is usually preferred, and one is called yeast, largely used by the industries, and bacteria also to some extent it is used. Why the bacteria is chosen, the reason is that bacteria, we know the doubling time of bacteria is much less as compared to yeast. That is why we preferred, some cases we prefer the yeast bacteria. But most of the cases we use Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is easy to use. It is very easy to use. Most of the cases for alcohol fermentation process we use Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is very hard cell wall, very easy to grow. Then Saccharomyces galbaigensis is also used for this fermentation process. Saccharomyces cerevisiae usually called top fermenting yeast. Saccharomyces culvergens is usually called bottom fermenting yeast. Saccharomyces ellipsoideus, that is mostly used for winemaking industries. Other Saccharomyces species also used in some typical fermentation process. And as far bacteria is concerned, we use the Zymomonas mobilis, now has the potentiality to convert sugar into alcohol. The factors that affect the ethanol fermentation process is the efficiency of the pretreatment. This is very important. Then optimum concentration of sugar, because we have observed that I told you in one of my lecture I mentioned that the recovery cost or purification cost depends on the that concentration of product in the fermentation broth. Now, if the concentration of the product in the fermentation broth is high, then recovery cost will be less. So, we usually prefer the high concentration of the concentration of product in the fermentation broth. Now, in this case, if we increase the ethanol concentration in the fermentation broth, we shall have to use more sugar. And if you use higher sugar concentration, then it causes some kind of osmotic pressure, and we shall have to develop some osmotolerant yeast culture, so that it can withstand the high sugar concentration. Also, it should withstand the high ethanol concentration. The osmotolerant and alcohol tolerant culture is very much required. So, optimum concentration of sugar is very important. Then optimum pH and temperature. The yeast fermentation usually taking place at the acidic pH and at around 4.5 to 5, and temperature is close to ambient temperature, is equal to 30 degrees centigrade. Addition of nutrient as per because we required some nitrogen, magnesium or phosphorus that we sometimes use as per the requirement. And use of vigorous strain of is we use the high productive strain, that industrial strain we use which has high productivity. Maintenance of anaerobic condition during fermentation process, because that anaerobically that yeast can convert the sugar into alcohol. So, anaerobic condition is very required. Now, one thing I want to point out here, the alcohol fermentation process is the fermentation process usually can take place in the open vat. We don't require much of sterile conditions. The reason is that because it, as I mentioned, that it produces in acidic pH. Acidic pH, less number of organism can grow, and also initially that I told you the yeast can grow under aerobic conditions, and it produces the cell mass. Under anaerobic condition it produces the alcohol. So, initially whatever dissolved oxygen is there, that will be used by the yeast cells for their growth and metabolism. Then as soon as that is consumed, the anaerobic condition prevail, it convert the sugar into alcohol. So, automatically the anaerobic condition, a few number of organisms can grow, and usually I mentioned that cane molasses or molasses is found suitable for the alcohol fermentation process. I shall explain why molasses is suitable for the alcohol fermentation process in my next slides. Now, then prompt distillation of the fermented mass, that is also very much required. Now, the characteristics of alcohol fermentable yeast are as follows: is to, as I mentioned, it should tolerate high concentration of sugar and alcohol, high fermenting power of sugar, more rate of fermentation. I initially couple of slides I mentioned that characteristics of the organism we can determine with respect to Ks and Mumax value. And I also mentioned that when I discussed the Ludeking Pirate model for product formation, I told you that alcohol is a growth associated product. That means rate of alcohol formation is proportional to the rate of cell mass formation. So, more cell mass formation is there, more alcohol formation will take place in the system. Now, so high fermenting power is very important. high biochemical stability, that is also very important. More we have biochemical stability, so that in a fermentation process we have uniform alcohol concentration, which is very much desirable in the industry. It tolerates the wide range of pH with acidic optima, which makes the fermentation less susceptible to infection than bacteria can grow in unstable conditions. This is the major advantage of this alcohol fermentation process. Now, mechanism of this alcohol fermentation process can be explained with the help of this Newburgh theory and the Emmons-Meyer-Parnas pathways. And Newburgh theory is mainly the theoretical basis, and UMP pathway is mainly based on the experimental facts. And you find that here this is the glucose molecules, then hydrated the methyl glyoxal. This is converted to pyruvic acid, then acetaldehyde, then then ethanol. This is how it produced. Then other way, one way it can produce glycerol, another way it can produce the acetic acid, also it can produce ethanol. But Emmons-Meyer pathway I don't like to mention, because we know Emmons-Meyer pathway, the glucose is converted to pyruvic acid, 1 mole of glucose is converted 2 mole of pyruvic acid, and then same procedure is used, that it under decarbonylation reaction we produce the acetaldehyde, then hydrate, when is reduced, further reduction take place, it produces the ethanol. Now, stoichiometry of this process is like this: 1 mole of glucose can produce 2 mole of ethanol and 2 mole of carbon dioxide. So, 100 grams, if you see the 100 grams of glucose, as per stoichiometry, it produces 51.1 kg of ethanol and 48.9 kg of carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide, I want to mention, it is pure carbon dioxide. So, most of the industry, they carry out though this fermentation can be carried out in the open vat, but they usually carry out in the closed vessel, so that we can collect this carbon dioxide, and the high pressure it can convert into dry ice, and they send it to the some cold drinks producing industries. The theoretical yield is coming about 51.1%. That is. Now, a typical analysis of the fermentation product that I have given here, that material analysis, that 100 grams of glucose produce 48.4 grams. So, you can see before the stoichiometrically it is 51.1 kg, but it is the actual practice we will get less amount of ethanol than 46 point. We can see here that 48.9 kg, here we have 46.6, glycerol 3.6, succinic acid 0.6, and cell mass. Besides that, it produces fusel oil. Fusel oil is nothing but the higher alcohols that also it produced during this fermentation process. Now, during I told you that cane molasses is considered as a very effective raw materials for this ethanol fermentation process, and cane molasses is a byproduct of the sugar industry. It produces this is produced from the high temperature destruction of sugar during the evaporation of sugar and the cane juice and the sugar drying process. So, some kind of during heating process, some destruction of the sugar take place. As for example, fructose will convert it to 1,3-fructopyranose. This is simple. By the dehydration we get this product, glucose fructose amino acid, they form the non-fermentable caramel residue. This is the Maillard reactions. So, this is also not fermentable. Then here we know the pyrolysis, that the sugar when undergo pyrolysis is produced the hydroxymethyl furfural, acetone, formic acid and levulinic acid. These are not produced, this cannot be produced ethanol. So, this non-fermentable sugar also present in the media to some extent. So, let me share that type of alcohol fermentation process that as per when alcohol is used as a beverage, it can be divided into two types. One is called distilled alcohol, another is a non-distilled alcohol. Now, what do you mean by distilled alcohol? Distilled alcohol means that after the fermentation is over, it passes through the distillation process, and through the distillation process we get the pure alcohol. Pure means I am saying that by normal distillation process, maximum alcohol concentration we get about 95%. Above 95%, it forms the isotopic mixture with water. In that case, even through the distillation you cannot separate the alcohol from the water, so you have to use the different solvent like benzene to get the absolute alcohol. Absolute alcohol means it contains the 100% of 100% of alcohol. Now, concentration of alcohol in the industry usually expressed in degree proof. Now, suppose we have 100 degree proof, 100 degree proof. 100 degree proof is approximately equal to, this is equal to about 50% volume by volume ethanol. So, if you say 200 degree proof, it contains about 100% of volume by volume ethanol. So, this is called absolute alcohol. This is called absolute alcohol. And we talk about the denatured alcohol. In the denatured alcohol, actually the denatured alcohol usually contain less than 95% alcohol, ethanol. Now, I told you denatured alcohol is a purposefully it makes unfit for human consumption by adding different ingredients. Now, here the distilled alcohol means we through the distillation process we separate the alcohol, and this alcohol we mix with different ingredients to give the different color and flavor. Now, we have different distilled alcohol. We have whiskey, rum, vodka, brandy and gin, but this actually whiskey actually usually produced from wheat starch, and rum usually produced from this cane molasses, brandy usually produced from fruit juices. So, different distilled alcohol has the different raw materials that is used for this production process, and different company they have different trade name. That for the like whiskey we have different company, they have different different company have different trade name, and their taste is varies with respect to the spices, because after the alcohol fermentation, alcohol separation is taking place. This alcohol mixed with different spices to give different smell and different taste. So, different taste and different, that is depend on the formula, that what kind of spices they use to give the, and that is 100% trade secret as per different industries. This never Scotch whiskey, I can give the example, that is has a typical flavor and typical color. So, this is rum, we have typical flavor and typical color. So, vodka, brandy and gin. Now, here I want to point out the brandy usually produced from the fruit juices. Now, when we go to the market and try to purchase the brandy, and if it is written in the bottle that artificial, then it is not produced from the fruit juices, because it artificial means maybe it produced from cane molasses or some other processes, and then they add some spices in such a way it gives the taste of brandy, and the taste it give the taste of brandy. So that is how it is produced. Now, non-distilled liquor, we have several. We have beer, we have wine, we have cider, we have the mead. Now, beer we largely use. We have two type of beer is largely in market: lager and alley beer. And wine is also largely used. The cider is usually produced from apple juice, and mead is usually produced from honey, and we add some fruit juices in it. Now, here I want to point out that alcohol concentration in the distilled liquor is much higher, is more than 45%, 45 to 50%, whereas beer we have about 4 to 8%, and we have, in case of wine, it might be 10 to 20%. Cider we might be, it varies, it may be 2 to 8%, and mead also it is 5 to maybe 20%. So we have different concentration as per different so here, in case of non-distilled liquor, we can use directly the fermentation broth. We just separate the cell mass and we use that and pass through the maturation process and then use for direct consumption. Now, this is the block flow diagram of the ethanol fermentation process, how it is taking place. And this is feedstock, we put it, but we shall have to do the material handling. Then we do the pre-treatment process. I mentioned in case of starch and in case of cellulose we require pre-treatment, but in case of sugar, cane molasses, we don't require any much of pre-treatment. Then this is hydrolysis or fermentation. After the fermentation, it passes through the distillation process, and then through the process of evaporation, we separate the ethanol, and this wastewater, that after the pre-treatment some waste is produced, that we can use for the steam generation, and the wastewater treatment we produce some biogas, and the biogas can be used for running the boilers, and from the boilers we can use the steam that for the distillation purpose. So this is a very simple block flow diagram for the ethanol fermentation process. I think in my next presentation I shall give the detailed information of the ethanol fermentation process. Now, in this presentation I give you the overview of the ethanol fermentation process, how the ethanol fermentation take place, what is the classification of the different type of alcohol that is marketed. I told you tax alcohol and non-tax alcohol. Tax alcohol is a pure alcohol, non-tax alcohol is the impure alcohol. Non-tax alcohol usually used as a chemical feedstock by the chemical industry, and but the cost of the non-tax alcohol is much cheaper as compared to tax alcohol. So then how this ethanol formation take place, I talk about the different metabolic pathway, and we also discuss about the distilled alcohol and non-distilled alcohol. Thank you very much.